The more value you place on your life, the greater you will recognize the need to set boundaries.
Welcome to the Q4 Impact Podcast, where through scripture, story, and conversation, we inspire you to make an impact all the way through the fourth quarter of your life. Welcome back to the Q4 Impact Podcast. Ron and I are joined today by a dear friend of mine, Dr. John Mokossian, who is a licensed pastoral psychotherapist. Since 1996, John has been the executive director of the New England Pastoral Institute in Salem, New Hampshire. He comes to us with his Master's of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary and a Doctorate of Ministry in Psychology from the Andover Newton Theological School. John's practice includes individuals, couples, and family psychotherapies. Welcome, John.
Thank you. Good to be here with you.
Thank you. Now, in that introduction, I used a term that is probably not very familiar to most, and that is pastoral psychotherapy or psychotherapist. Would you please take a few minutes and just share exactly what that is?
Sure. I am very blessed and fortunate to in one of the 6 states in the country that license pastoral psychotherapists as a unique mental health discipline. And that which qualifies us to receive that licensure is not just our clinical experience, but our educational experience. All of us have masters in divinities and doctorates in psychology. So what we are uniquely posed to do is to make sure that in our work with clients, we integrate the spiritual realm with the psychological realm. Gallup says 87% of all who come into therapy request, want, and desire their spiritual beliefs to be honored in that therapy. And that's our specialty, the integration of both of those two worlds.
And it truly is a specialty. I can attest firsthand. So I also know that one of your particular interests in therapy is in family and peer relationships, which makes you so perfectly fitted to today's conversation. Because as we talk about how healthy boundaries are necessary for good relationships, we'd like to get your input on that. So do you agree with that statement that to have healthy relationships, healthy boundaries must exist?
Let's start and do it this way. So there are major fields of psychology that are relationally rooted. Object relations theory says that we understand our sense of self through the primary relationships of our early life, mother, father, siblings, and such. And those relationships become formulative in terms of our understanding of who we are. Systems theory says that we become the truth, best and worst, through the relationships in our family of origin, and that our families of origin shape everything about our understanding of self. Now, when I bring my spiritual perspective into that, especially when we're talking about a relational reality, my relationship with Christ is formulative in my understanding of who I am. So the way those works come together relationally is Jesus becomes part of my family. Jesus becomes my identity, and I am formed, shaped through a combination of all of those relationships that bring about who I am.
You just said something it could be fairly complex, very simply. So thank you. But I think before we go much further, it might be helpful to ask you to provide some definition about what we actually mean by healthy boundaries, since that's going to be our focus for today.
Okay, I can do that. So let's start with the flip side of that. You know that there's in your boundaries when you start feeling any of these things, and they're incremental and they exist in a paradigm. So if I start becoming squeamish or leery, comfortable, feeling that I've been diminished, recognizing now that we're getting at a very dangerous point, or I've been hurt, insulted, and the worst, being violated, those are boundary issues. Mm-hmm. So healthy boundaries are absolutely critically important to a successful relationship. Without boundaries, we don't thrive. We diminish. We become resentful, hurt, disappointed. Our identity becomes confused, and in the worst scenario, violated. So boundaries really comprise about 6 areas of our life, and every one of them is critically important. The first being physical boundaries. Your needs are important. It's okay to say, I'm tired, to rest. It's okay to say, I'm hungry, or I need to sit down. When I read this, Jesus did a really good job of this. He would often tell his disciples, look, I'm done. Take me out to the middle of the lake. Let me go to sleep. Let everybody see I'm asleep, and they'll leave. So he knew when he was tired, and he took care of that. The trickiest part about this is touch. Unfortunately, way too many people I know have experienced horrific touch. So this thing that our space boundaries are honored is very important. It's okay to say, I don't like to hug, just shake my hand. It's okay to claim space and to make sure that the kind of touch you're allowing is healthy. But that's cultural. If I'm having an argument with one of my Armenians and you're watching me, you're going to get very uncomfortable because we're going to go nose to nose. In our culture, that's way too close. But in my Armenian culture, that's perfectly acceptable. Mm-hmm. So physical space is critically important to make sure being honored. The second is emotional boundaries, where you're reading my feelings, not just my feelings. And you know that your feelings are being disrespected, violated, when you hear things like, feel that way. It's wrong to feel that way. It's okay to say to somebody, look, we can talk anything, but if you're going to criticize me and insult me, I don't want to talk about this. It's okay to say somebody, look, I'm really sorry you're going through a really difficult time, but so am I. And the information that's coming is really overwhelming. I'm not in a place I can honor what's going on between us, and we need to stop this conversation. Emotional boundary violations do things like criticize our feelings, demand that we justify the way we feel. The one that I hate most is when somebody tells me how I should be feeling. Mm-hmm. And that's a violation because it's not honoring the truth of who I am. Your understanding of who you want me to be rather than valuing who I am. Time boundaries. A lot of folks have a problem with it. I once did a pastor seminar where I asked the pastors to tell their priorities in ministry. They all created this wonderful sense of what's important to them. I then asked them to go through a very detailed understanding of their time. And of the 364 hours of the week, that they quantified 360. And at the end of this exercise, I said to them, show me how you spend time and I'll tell you what's most important to you. What we found is how they spent their time and what they claimed to be important didn't match. So our time, one of our most valuable commodities. There's no doubt about that. Showing up late. That's a violation of boundaries. I need to get somebody to talk a whole lot more than need to talk. I know people, I know people you can't say hello to unless you have a half an hour. That's a violation of boundaries. It happens way too often. One that I don't want to embarrass any of your listeners, but one of the most chronic areas is sexual. So I'm going to do this one. I'm going to gloss over this really quickly. I'm going to say proper sexual boundaries include consent, agreement and respect. So let me move away from the what those boundaries are and point to the ways in which that boundary is violated to a lesser degree. Every single woman knows when she's being checked out. It's a violation of her personhood. Unwanted sexual comments. That's a violation of your boundary. It's a horrific thing to feel like, oh, I like what just happened to me. And that shareable exchange. That's really horrific. For most life, I have been a very active human being. I've played a lot of basketball. I played a lot of racquetball. I played at health club 6 days a week. But I tell you, I never went into the men's locker room. And the reason that I didn't go into the locker room was a violation of my personal, especially around the way men treat. I did not want to be exposed to that conversation. Conversations I felt were incredibly sexually appropriate, and it was for me to just tell people, look, I can't do it, so I don't need to expose myself to it. The funny thing for me was, despite the fact that I would never go into the locker room, time one of those men was having some sort of difficulty, I would get a tap on the shoulder and, John, can I talk to you for a little bit? Of course, I would say yes. That's one I want to do is material boundaries, our possessions and our property, how people use them and how we let people use them. That's about you. So if I loaned you something, I can expect how I want to receive it back. And if it's not to me in a way that my expectations, you just violated my boundary. I can't lend you a car. You're not on my insurance. That's a material possession boundary. So boundaries really identify the things that are important to us. And we're able to voice that in such a way that we command respect that we deserve, while we also respect the other person reserves for their boundaries. So that's a nice glossing over a whitewash of what boundaries really look like.
I appreciate that. I think myself and probably many listening would love to have a copy of everything you just said, because talk about a guideline and kind of just a reminder of all of these areas in our lives that benefit from and need healthy boundaries. So thank you for sharing that.
John, I wrote in our blog that is connected to this podcast that the more value that you place on your life, the greater you'll recognize the need to set boundaries. And I would even, after listening to you, I might write that a little differently and and say something like, the more we realize our own personal value and how God views us, the more healthy our self-esteem is, perhaps the more we see the need to identify what are healthy boundaries in our lives. Would you agree with that statement?
The way I would respond to that, Ron, is that Jesus did it really well when he said the most important commandment of all is your love of God. Second is the love of neighbor, yourself. Any of us are very good at loving God, allowing God to love us. We're okay at loving others, but we have a very relationship with ourselves. Jesus took really good care of himself and made sure that people understood his boundaries and honored his boundaries. Mm-hmm. So yes, the better we understand ourselves, the better we are equipped in self-awareness and actualization and take care of ourselves in such a way that we're the truth of who we are. the better we're going to live with ourselves, with others, and promote connection.
Right. I love, Ron, that you brought up the self-esteem issue. But I want to take us back a little bit to the pastoral psychotherapy piece of this, and I'm going to use myself as an example because I think from childhood I was blessed in my family of origin, my relationship with God, and I have had a positive self-esteem. However, through the years, there have been some areas in my life where I have had healthy boundaries and others where I have not. And for me, a lot of the lack of those healthy boundaries stemmed in areas that perhaps I didn't have a proper understanding around or some confusion, specifically even like biblical, like Christian type of principles. So specific example would be in marriage, how we serve, in our Christian lives, how we give, the denying of ourselves, these wonderful principles and things to which we've been called, and yet not always having proper boundaries for myself around those. So, John, you've actually worked with me in some of these areas through the years. So, would you please speak to this stumbling block a little bit and how that works with the people that you work with?
Probably the most important piece of my work, anyone who steps into my office, is what I refer to as the deconstruction of an image. Okay, so we are all created in the image of God. Wonderful. The problem is that through our human experience and through the kind of development that we experience as we're growing up spiritually, usually we don't have the healthiest image of God that is biblically rooted. Our impression of who God is dependent upon how we've been treated by the most important people in our lives. Dads, I'm sorry, but actually fathers. And if we have experienced harsh treatment from our dads, we typically refer to God as being harsh and critical. Most of us think God as this big, whited, bearded individual in the sky with his finger pointing and waiting for us to make a mistake so he can grab us and say, bad, bad, bad. You don't find that in Scripture, and especially in the New Testament. Jesus came so that we would understand the full extent how much God loved us and was willing to sacrifice himself to prove to us. So helping people work through wrong assumptions that they come to about faith, get to a place where they have healthier understandings of faith, that's what's going to promote us becoming everything God intended us to be.
John, this is such a big topic. I'm sitting here thinking of all the roles that I have in my life. I was a son, I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a grandfather, I'm an employer, I'm a board member, I'm a friend, I'm a mentor, and the need for boundaries exists. Yeah, all of them. So how do we get our audience to perhaps pay more attention or to examine themselves and recognize when their boundaries are unhealthy or missing?
So let me start with an example from my work, the 15-year-old kid a few years ago. I'm sitting here with a kid and I'm asking her questions about her thoughts and her feelings. And every time I ask a question, she looks at her mom and waits for the answer. Their identities were so confused. The poor kid couldn't answer a question about what she's thinking or feeling without her mom jumping in. So that's an identity confusion. So the question that I would ask to people who are wondering about how they are experiencing boundaries and understanding whether they're healthy or not, The first thing I want to know is, do you know who you are? Do you have a really good understanding of you, your strengths, your weaknesses, the things that speak you, identify you, define you? Do you know who you are apart from anybody else? If I extract all of the influences of your life, can you tell me who you are? Do you know what your non-negotiables are? What your principles and your values? Nobody can get you to move from them. That's a critically important piece of knowing how to voice what your boundaries are and how to make sure that they're understood. So, if you're in a place where your boundaries are unhealthy, you're going to get hurt. You're going to get hurt emotionally. You're going to get hurt physically. You're going to get hurt spiritually. And you're going to get hurt intellectually.
That is definitely a good signal, I guess, to pay attention to, because we all know what hurt feels like.
We all know.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I think that sometimes when we're talking about how do we recognize, I think sometimes we can have blinders on that prevent us from seeing or recognizing that a boundary issue even exists. And I'll still use myself as the example today. Is I know there have been times that I have so wanted to maintain kind of the narrative, the story that I was telling myself, that it kept me only focusing on what I defined as good. And it kept me from then recognizing necessarily what was always true. So do you see this, and what usually helps someone to begin to kind of take those blinders off to recognize that their boundaries are lacking, or whether it be in strength or just present altogether?
I'm going to say all of that in my own language.
Okay.
When you feel lost, when you feel confused, when you feel dependent, when you feel that somebody has so much power over you that they can feel for you, when you can't tell where you begin and somebody else ends, when you can't think and act for yourself, you're sitting in boundary violation. Unfortunately, this is a gender thing. Unfortunately, especially for Christian women, it hurts my heart to even have to say this kind of thing. Women tend to be what it is they hope they can create in life. And as a result of that, because they have so much energy around what is the best possible reality that they can participate and create in, they often cannot see what's right in front of them. So their hope gets in the way of what the truth of their reality is. And unless you're with the truth of what your reality is, you're not promoting your best self. That's a toughie.
Yeah.
That's a toughie.
Yeah.
John, listening to these last few minutes, it just makes me think of the word risk and the risks that all of us are vulnerable to when we haven't done the work of identifying what healthiness looks like.
Well said.
It's scary. It really is. And I would guess you've seen many hundreds of people who have suffered as a result of just not having healthy boundaries. What's the advice maybe you would the common person, the everyday person who's listening, what would we say to them today?
Ron, I would tell them that they need to be doing their own inner work. Too many of us focus on the externals of life. How we're getting along with people is very important. We think of ourselves and identify ourselves. If we don't have a core standing on solid ground when we bring ourselves to other people, we're standing on safe. And my experience, I don't mean to insult anybody, and I'm not talking to anybody in particular. My experience is most human beings start developing at the age of 16. Are at 16 is who they are at 35, 55, 65, 75. They're not expanding understanding of what it means to be their best self. Stop working. You know, my work is to prod and to double and help people really delve to some of their own about their own identity and definition. Tough work. And times we need someone to guide us along that journey. And that's one of the things that I see myself doing in my work with human beings. I am the direction that we're heading in is best self.
It's good. It's very good. I know that's been one of our goals in today's podcast, is just to provide some direction to the one who, by listening, is beginning to realize, oh, like this is an issue. I need to work on boundaries, to do that inner work that you're talking about. But recognizing it and then being able to begin seeing it through a new lens and making changes is not something that happens overnight. It is a process, and there is learning that comes from that inner work. So what would you want to say to that person who maybe by listening today is saying, oh, I need to give this some attention? What direction should they take?
Well, my very best friends in the world is a guy by the name of Ron. He's a pastor out in California. And Ron told me years ago, here's what's between you and me. He said, when I tell the mountain to move in my life, biblical reference, Jesus says, you know, we can do that with mountains. When I tell the mountain to move in my life, I expect the mountain to be picked up, transported, and dropped into the ocean in one big swift swoop. He says to me, when you try to move a mountain, you say, okay, God, give me a shovel. It'll work to move a mountain. and unless we're willing to do work, it's very unlikely that the mountain is just going to get moved for us.
Yep.
We have to work.
Good advice. Do not grow weary in well-doing, right?
There you go.
Yeah. Ron, any last comments before we wrap up today's conversation?
I'm trying to figure out how to limit what I want to say. I think maybe the main message of today is hearing you say, John, that it's a lot of work and that people need to take it seriously and do the work. Do the work. We look around us and there's so much attention to the outer things of life. There's so much distraction, so much activity, access to sports and pleasures and travel and everything is external. And yet none of that can get so ruined when we neglect what's going on inside of us and those key relationships that we have with our spouses, with our children, with our parents, our employers. Those are the things that are really going to bring value to our lives. So I think I would just say, let's all do the work. Let's get serious about wanting to be the best version of ourselves and take the time to think about these things. They're so, so important.
So, Ron, let's take that back to the very core of what you're trying to accomplish with Q4. We haven't done the work by the core. We're going to miss a lot of things. And the matter is, in the fourth quarter of life, that's when we get to express all the learned throughout life. That's where wisdom where the gray is of value, all the things that we have moved through and learned through to understand the truth of who we are and how to treat the way they deserve to be. So yeah, it's about the work, but it's also about giving glory to God and making sure that we bring ourselves by being is that we are called to be in relation to ourselves and in relationship to people who are closest to us. That's the formula for success.
Well said. John, thank you so very much for being with us today. I know we've all learned a lot, and I know everyone who takes the time to listen is going to gain a lot of this. And that is our prayer, that we all take from the years of knowledge and practical experience that you have shared with us today from this issue, so that all of our relationships can continue to grow in healthy mutuality for the good of everyone involved. So earlier, we spoke of some of the risk or the damage that can occur when there is the absence of healthy boundaries. But sadly, we recognize that when these boundaries are absent, it can at times impact the whole trajectory of our life. And when that happens, there's usually things that have occurred that requires forgiveness. So that is what we will be talking about next week. Please join us as we discuss how we choose to forgive. Thanks for listening. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Q4 Impact Podcast. To continue receiving encouragement and practical tips on how to live with purpose and meaning through the many changes and challenges of life, please be sure to subscribe. And please share it with others you think may also benefit.